classes have been small. August is always a month that a lot of people are away.
I can't believe we're in August.
You're almost in September. Good morning, Mary.
No, we don't mention that yet.
So let's begin. We'll start with a 30-minute meditation. This morning's talk is on the Khema Sutta, the Sutta on unanswered questions. It's a very interesting sutta. And it helps focus our Dhamma practice to avoid getting into speculative aspects of life, and the universe and existence. Just keep it focused on waking up. But we'll meditate first for 30 minutes. So find your relaxed meditative posture. Gently close your eyes and gently close your mouth. And holding your back straight but not stiff. Your ears aligned with your shoulders. Your nose aligned with your navel. And holding yourself very loosely, very lovingly. Allow yourselves to settle into this room. Settle onto your seats. Settle into your bodies. And settle into your minds. And take a moment to become aware of the sensation of breathing in your body. What that's like. To be mindful of your breath in your body. And while remaining mindful of your breath in your body, notice that thoughts are flowing. We're conscious beings. Thoughts should be flowing. The purpose of meditation is to not be distracted by your own thoughts. So when you find that you're caught up in your thinking again, simply acknowledge that and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. I'll repeat that. When you find that you're caught up in your thinking again, that and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. Relaxing your thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. And we'll meditate for 30 minutes with callbacks every 5 minutes. relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. Relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of our breathing. Relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. If a persistent thought or feeling arises, stay with it for a moment or two. Recognize it as impermanent and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. And we'll meditate for 5 more minutes. Take a moment to notice the quality of your mind. Be at peace with your mind. And when you're ready, you can gently open your eyes. See you Tuesday. So this sutta is called the Khema Sutta, the sutta on unanswered questions. This is a common theme throughout the Buddhist teaching. People would put questions to him that, for many reasons, didn't deserve an answer, or the answer would only lead to more confusion, that he simply refused to answer. He would often just sit quietly. And that was a sign that the question itself is unanswered. Background on this, the Buddha awakened to something called dependent origination, which simply states, from a very specific ignorance, all manner of confusion, deluded thinking, and suffering arises. And that specific ignorance is ignorance of Four Noble Truths. So I talked about that often, but I just want to lay that background. That the problem of ongoing suffering that the Buddha sought an answer to, he finally realized that it was rooted in ignorance. So anything that would continue ignorance is not something that the Buddha would pursue, because he understood the problem there. The Buddha did, this is from the article, the Buddha did not make a definitive declaration or left unanswered questions that should not be answered, as the declaration or direct answer would likely develop additional confusion or distraction. So it's aspect of a self-referential ego self that insists that every question that it can come up with has an answer. And it gets very upset when an answer isn't provided, or the answer is an unsatisfying answer. The reason why is anytime that is, the question has an underlying need for continuing self-establishment. And that's why an answer to any question that this confused, deluded mind can come up with, it insists on having an answer. And the Buddha, of course, realized that. The Buddha wouldn't answer a question if the question itself was rooted in ignorance. Answering directly would reinforce ignorance and would not lead to understanding and release from clinging. The Buddha would often simply remain silent when a question put to him was an improper question, or would lead to, in his words, he used this phrase often, a thicket of views, meaning you just get caught up in this self-referential way of looking at the world that there's no way out of. The Buddha used that term also to describe the quality of his mind prior to his awakening, thicket of views, being stuck in that. In the Khema Sutta, King Pasenadi heard that a senior disciple of the Buddha's, the Bhikkhuni, Khema, was visiting the area. He asked if a Bhikkhuni is a female, is a nun. He asked if Khema be summoned to him. Khema agreed and met with the king. King Pasenadi had an interest in different spiritual teachings spreading throughout northern India, and had a series of questions for Khema. And a lot of those spiritual theories were based on the Vedas, which were common at the time, the precursor to modern Hinduism. Bhikkhuni Khema, does the Tathagata, meaning the Buddha, the rightly self-awakened one, does he exist after death? One question, what happens to me after I die? Khema responds, Great King, the Tathagata has not declared that he exists after death. Further, he has not declared that the Tathagata does not exist after death. Notice the words there. He didn't declare whether he does or doesn't. He's not saying he doesn't, or he's not saying he does. He's simply not declaring it. Why? Because it would only further ignorance. The question itself does not lead to developing understanding of his Dhamma. It's an irrelevant question. The king continues, Khema, does the Tathagata both exist and not exist after death? Which is another one of the conclusions that came out of the Vedas, that there's this kind of existence / non-existence that we're all a part of. And of course, that's ridiculous. But when questions couldn't be answered to the satisfaction of a self-referential ego self, systems were often developed that answered the questions without answering the questions. So it sounds silly when you look at it that way. A lot of religions that deal in the next life come to that conclusion. We both exist and we don't exist. And they use the vehicle as a soul to house that existence. And again, it's just a common, and I'm not declaring that that's not true. The Buddha's not declaring it's not true. He's simply saying it's not useful, and place yourself in those situations. The goal is to develop understanding of what's occurring right now. And isn't that logical? If your mind is stuck in some speculative state of being, How can you deal with what's going on here? The king continues, well, dear lady, why is it the blessed and most learned one, meaning the Buddha, has not declared answers to these questions? What harm could there be in providing guidance? Notice the underlying ego there, though. He's justifying his own insistence for an answer by saying that it's a reasonable question. Of course it's not a reasonable question. King, I will question you in response to your questions. Please answer as you see fit. Do you employ an accountant who could count the grains of sand in the river? And could that learned accountant declare the number of grains of sand in the river Ganges? No, dear lady, I do not employ an accountant that could answer that question. The grains of sand in the river Ganges are too numerous and too difficult to fathom. Could your accountant declare the number of buckets of water in the great ocean? No, dear lady, I do not employ an accountant that could answer that question. The great ocean is too deep and boundless and too difficult to understand. Tathagata, great king, having abandoned all clinging and destroyed the roots of future becoming, is freed from form. The awakened one is deep, boundless, and difficult to understand. The questions you ask do not apply to an awakened one. Any feeling or perception or mental fabrication, any consciousness that would be used to pose these questions are themselves rooted in ignorance. You remember dependent origination in the chain of causative links. Beginning in ignorance, follow. Mental fabrications. Mental fabrications are simply false assumptions rooted in ignorance that we make about ourselves in relation to the world. And that leads to the next link of consciousness. Again, not a grand cosmic type of consciousnness, but an ongoing thinking rooted in ignorance and informed by those false assumptions. So obviously anything that follows from ignorance can only further ignorance. Right? So the Buddha's entire teaching is to develop wisdom where there was once ignorance. What vehicle did he use for teaching that? The Eightfold Path. And it's the only vehicle he ever taught. King Pasenadi saw the deep wisdom in this answer and was delighted. He thanked Khema and departed. A short while later, he went to the Buddha and asked the very same questions. And he received exactly the same response from the Buddha. The king thanked the Buddha for his teachings and deep wisdom and for the consistency that his disciples preserved his teachings. Isn't that important too? The king bowed to the Buddha delighted and returned to his duties as king. 5 years of his teaching career, the Buddha consistently declared that he teaches the understanding of stress or dukkha and confusion and the cessation of stress and confusion. Nothing more. And he said this repeatedly, always trying to keep the focus on what he was teaching, because it kept coming up. The people wanted answers to these great questions, and they wanted answers to mundane questions that themselves didn't have answers to. And I'll talk on that in just a moment. He consistently avoided answering questions that were rooted in a confused ego personality and would only lead to a more entrenched ego. Looked at closely, the questions of King Pasenadi, they arise from anatta, a misunderstanding of self. And what the Buddha teaches is not a self. The king's questions seek to further establish a self rather than after the current form, the physical body, animated by the sixth sense base, ceases to exist after death. Now, if you think about a self-referential ego self that is really only concerned with its own self-preservation, is the biggest problem, isn't it? Because it can't know what happens to me after death, but yet it continually seeks to establish an answer to that. A lot of religions have grown up just around that one point, to provide an answer to what happens to me after death. And then that's brought back to teach morals, but in a way that we act in a moral and ethical way to acquire something, meaning a good life after this life, rather than what the Buddha taught. To act in a moral and ethical and virtuous way because of how it affects you and everyone around you in this life and in this moment. That's what the Eightfold Path. And that's where the difference is between what the Buddha taught, and again, I'm not putting down religion, but it's just a difference, and the morals and ethics that are taught in most religions. And even in modern Buddhist religions, acting in a certain way is often taught as gaining merit, is useful and will be realized in a future life. And the Buddha realized the foolishness. I think that's the end of it. There's a little bit more to that, but let me get into something else. The Buddha realized that as part of the problem too, that the competitiveness and the aggressiveness of the people around him was driven for two reasons. One was to protect yourself and establish yourself in this life, but also because of the common religions of the time, yourself and establish yourself in a future life, which caused just as much confusion, deluded thinking, and anguish as the previous one. It's just carrying things for power or for to be recognized a certain way. And ultimately, both of those things were a distraction from what's occurring in this moment, meaning taking care of what's present. Ignorance, through 12 observable causative links, leads to all manner of confusion, delusion, and suffering, leads to that first noble truth of dukkha. So even with the great questions that should be left unanswered, that we shouldn't even consider, they're not even worth considering. Who am I? Where do I come from? Where do I go after I die? Who created all this? The wanderer Vacchagotta, you've heard me talk about him a few times. He kept coming in and out of the Buddha's life with basically the same questions. Is the universe finite or infinite? And the Buddha would either sit quietly, showing Vacchagotta that the questions themselves don't deserve an answer, or he would respond, Vacchagotta, it's your questions that are confusing you. Let go of the questions. Vacchagotta keeps coming in and out of in the suttas because he can't let go of these questions, and he remains confused and deluded. He remains disappointed with his life because these great questions can't be answered. And yet these are the questions that we've been asking for all time, and we still do, don't we? We want answers to these questions. Just as distracting and just as agitating are questions that don't seem so mystical and esoteric, but really are basically the same thing. When we ask ourselves, why did anything happen to me? Grand mystical question. What was the forces behind my car breaking down every week? What were the forces that caused me to have that argument with that person at work? What were the forces to have my partner be unhappy with me? What were the forces that created terrorist attacks? What were the forces behind this and behind that? Those are all rooted in a type of self-referential need for distraction, because there is no answer to something other than it's what has occurred. Now we can get into, and I don't want to get into the anthropological look at cultural systems and how they develop. We can certainly find roots to anything and put a finger on it and say, well, this is where it started. But even at that point, you're deluding yourself, because there is no real root cause to anything. It's all part of a process that, if we really want to extract ourselves from it, we recognize that all of it is a process that's rooted in ignorance. And so the solution isn't finding a root cause in an ethnological way or in a biological way. The answer is realizing that it's ignorance. And yet we want to ignore that. It's an aspect of a self-referential ego self to ignore anything that would challenge its own ignorance. So we want to find a mystical or esoteric or more hidden reason to why all of the strife in the world arises. If we want to understand it and solve it, we look to ignorance. The second noble truth, right? Ignorance leads to suffering. The second noble truth says craving originates and clinging perpetuates suffering. At its root cause, craving is wanting anything to be different than it is. Initially, on the surface, when we start looking at it, we recognize craving as wanting something that gives us pleasure and wanting more of it. The opposite side of the same coin is aversion, wanting to avoid anything that would take away from that pleasure or our safety. But it's really craving, isn't it? It's really desire. It's wanting something to be different than it is. And we can do it with wanting more chocolate cake, and we can also do it with wanting the world to be different. Even though it might be reasonable to want things in the world to be different, such as competitiveness, aggressiveness, racism, terrorism, all of that. But the solution, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't take a stand when it's necessary, but the solution lies in ending ignorance. And whenever we try to fight ignorance with continued ignorance, what happens? The world explodes. Every time. When he describes, or he begins this great sutta, the Nigara Sutta, describing looking out on the world right after he awakened. And awakened meaning he developed an understanding of the nature of suffering in the world. And the first thing he declared was the world is a flame. If he awakened today, right now, he would say exactly the same thing, wouldn't he? We look out on the world through listening to the news or however we get connected with the world, we would say the same thing. And it scares the hell out of us, doesn't it? And it should. But what's the answer? The answer is recognizing the ignorance that drives all of that. It's right back to this idea of unanswered and answered questions. What are the questions that we should be asking ourselves? What are the questions that are most important to answer? It's not why is this happening. Where does it come from? It comes from ignorance. It comes from a lack of understanding. And if you can think clearly, now there's a lot of passion that grows up around some of the bigger questions, but even the smaller questions, like why did my boss get mad at me? It's almost the same thing, even though the effect isn't as immediate as terrorism or racism. But the question itself is rooted in ignorance, and that's the problem. Because we allow ourselves to get super distracted by the big questions and thinking that because those questions are so grave and so immediate, that that's a justifiable distraction from recognizing the most important and direct answer, which is addressing ignorance. The Buddha realized this upon his awakening, and he spent the next 45 years of his life, an awakened, fully mature human being, teaching just this one thing. The effect, as it developed, was immediate sphere of influence. And it still continues to this day. And the reason why I say that is the Buddha awakened, the world was aflame. There was just as much strife rooted in hatred and competitiveness then as there was now. But what he did was to teach the Dhamma, and he taught it to anyone who would listen. And on an individual way, he was able to bring that type of hatred and violence down. But he also taught the great leaders of his day. And every single one of them, as they developed the Dhamma, became less violent and more inclusive in their teaching. And that has spread around today. It's interesting now with the corruption of Buddhism that even so-called Buddhists are creating great racial strife within that. I'm talking about Myanmar right now. You know, it's unbelievable what's happening there in the name of Buddhism. And these so-called Buddhist monks feel justified in doing every awful thing they can to this a Muslim sect, only to keep it suppressed. Again, I don't want to get on that bandwagon because I could go off on that. It could never happen if these were true Buddhist practitioners, because if you develop the Eightfold Path, you end that type of hatred and narrow-mindedness, which is exactly what the Buddha set out to do. You know, again, he wasn't out he didn't see himself as a savior. He didn't see the Dhamma as something salvific. He just knew that it was incredibly practical in ending all of the strife in the world. So that's let me just finish it with that. The great questions are things that we should simply abandon because they're not useful to waste our speculative, just not helpful. But also recognize when we're asking ourselves questions that seem practical and deserving of an answer, but they also have an aspect of continuing distraction, of continuing ignorance. And that can get very subtle in the world today. The world is a flame, and it's a flame for the same reasons as it was 2,600 years ago. And the only real control we can have, this is why I say the most loving thing I can do for myself and for all sentient beings is to take to the Dhamma and awaken. Why? Because I have a twofold effect. One is I know that I'm no longer contributing. Even if it's in self-righteous indignation, I'm no longer contributing to the problem. And I'm allowing myself to be an example of what happens when a mind is calm and at peace. nothing contributing to the flames out there. No longer fueling the fires of passion out in the world. So an awakened human being realized that 2,600 years ago. We are very fortunate those teachings are still here today, and we can still employ them. I'll leave it at that. There's a lot. The reason why I'm cutting myself off is there's so much going on out there. It's easy to keep going on about it instead of realizing the main answer is for us to develop calm and peaceful minds through meditation and the entire Eightfold Path. And then we can go out in an informed way. Compassion married with wisdom, not just compassion, and truly have an effect on the world. So that's today's talk. Thank you. Any questions or comments on the talk, and then we'll go around the room?
One of the points you made that really, to me, struck home is when people don't act in a moral and ethical way, inevitably their lives are amiss.
Every time, Mary.
And it's just so true.
It is, and the answer is obvious, but it's so difficult. Even often seemingly altruistic actions are not rooted in real wisdom. And so even that expression of so-called morality can become hurtful.
Yeah.
And even if it doesn't, it often does, it continues our own agitation, doesn't it? And then we get into this whole self-righteous thing, and it's just not helpful, and it ultimately is hurtful. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm going to get off my soapbox. I'm on my soapbox.
Very thought-provoking speech right there. I mean, there's layers and layers. If you get, from what I'm getting out of it, even when we talk about morality and ethics, those are societal as well. Or ethic, even though this society may think they are. But we can go back in time and look at what people thought they're burning people because they were heretics was moral.
Yeah.
But there may be a society that would feel that's not. So even that is more of a way to say, oh, it's okay, you know. And so that even makes me think, like, these thoughts that are bombarding us from our society, to even question the morality of those things, of morality.
You're so right there. All those types of things. I'll use the Salem thing. It's a good example, because there's enough of a group acceptance of it. Then it seems like this is okay because okay to burn people at the stake because for whatever reason. That's the same common mentality that justifies all kinds of things that end up in a violent, hurtful way. It's, well, this way. Well, that's true. Not meaning most in a global way, but there's a lot of people that think a certain way, and that justifies the resulting action. And usually that action is an action against somebody else who thinks differently, and maybe justifiably so. And that's the problem. It's what your beliefs motivate you to do, rather than an enlightened, awakened way of dealing with the general strife in the world is to recognize it, don't engage in it, but don't put any fuel on the fire. In other words, remain calm and peaceful. Over the course of human development, we have put in place systems that can, if we allow them to work. I mean, this is really what's remarkable about today, but it's also the great failing of today. If we allow them to work, could deal with just about every social ill. The problem is we don't the way that they should work. And there's a lot. Again, I want to get in my sandbox again about why that's not happening. We evolved to the point as human beings that we have enough systems in place to maintain peace. The problem is we don't have the understanding, the individual understanding to maintain peace. And you're right, the implications are pretty far. And I don't want to sound hopeless. We've come a long way, but look what's going on in the world. The world is still aflame. Again, any questions or comments about what's going on? Or not what's going about the talk today. So Tim, welcome back. Tim joined us Tuesday, and he came Thursday, and now he came Saturday. There's no class tomorrow, Monday, so I'll see you Tuesday. But I'm always available through an email. How was your class today? How was your meditation?
Wonderful, thank you.
How's it going at home?
Good.
Good.
It's a work in progress.
Great. Oh, it always is. You know. Good. Well, I'm glad you're here today. Mike, good to see you again. It's been a while.
It has been too long. This is my first time meditating in 6 months, or so. And felt very good. It felt very good to be back here. I've had a lot of family strife going on, and I think one of the reasons that I cut back and eventually stopped is I have real difficulty feeling good about myself when the people around me are suffering. And it's almost like it's a guilt.
Yeah.
Like, why should I be feeling all that? And, after a while, I kind of it just went by the wayside. What got me back here actually was a friend of mine brought up the flight attendant theory. Put your mask on first, then you can help others. It's so simplistic, but it's really true. So that's what led me back.
I'm glad it led you back. I'm glad you're here. It's good to see you. Like I said, I was just thinking about you yesterday, wondering how you were doing. So, now, why should I be doing something that makes me feel good when everybody else is suffering around me is somewhat common, and it's often used to say that even within Buddhist circles, those that meditate and it's very self-indulgent to take the time to meditate and develop this practice because, it's so selfish. Of course it is, and it seems like that. But when you connect what is making you feel that way, it's only a self-referential view. Clinging to the outside world that's suffering, it might just be your immediate family, but I don't have a right to feel good or feel better when they're suffering. Of course, that's a clinging view, isn't it? And that the flight attendant view is the right view. I can be much more effective and helpful towards those around us, and then keeping it in today's talk to the world at large, if I'm awakened, if my mind is at peace. And just in a practical way, I'm much more efficient at peace, and I'm well concentrated. So if I really love the people closest to me, and if I really care about the world at large, I'll take to the Dhamma and awaken. I'm simply much more effective. That's often lost in even those that understand the Buddhist story. At the age of 29, he was in a position to have a great positive effect on the people around him. He was heir to the throne. I mean, these were little kingdoms. He wasn't the king of India, but there were numerous. But he was in a position of power. But he realized that political power wasn't the answer. And he didn't do anything in a completely meaningful way, meaning compassionately, until he awakened. He was ready to truly help people in a direct way. So it's good that you're here. Your family will reap the benefits of it. I mean, I'm not just throwing that out there. It's really true. I'm saying it because I believe it. How was your meditation? 30 minutes is a long time when you're just starting.
Yeah, I think when I was last year, it was 20 minutes.
Yeah, on Saturdays we do 30 minutes.
Okay. Yes. I was glad that I definitely drifted out and thoughts kept coming up.
Yep.
But I didn't get frustrated, which is what I was happy about. When you first said 30 minutes, I was like, wow, I don't think I've ever done 30 minutes, honestly. I think this is the first time that I've done 30.
Congratulations.
Thanks. And I was like, wow, this is going to be, it was just challenging at times to go in and out, but I didn't let myself get frustrated. So
good. So you've learned that good lesson. Be gentle with yourself, Mike. It's good to have you back.
Thanks.
Hey, Tim, how was that for you? I didn't ask you, but 30-minute meditation is a long meditation for.
Same.
And that's the way to look at it. It is what it is. I wouldn't suggest, unless it's comfortable for you, to do 30 minutes on your own until you build up to it. But in a group setting, it seems like there's some type of mystical support in making it.
That's true.
Eva, good to see you this morning. How are you?
It was a wonderful experience to meditate with everyone. I'm always impressed by how profound it seems everything the Buddha has ever said is.
Yeah.
But I particularly like this because of the question of religion and all that, and that just kind of puts it on the side. It's just not really necessary to look at it, and it relieves, it's a weight off my shoulders that I don't have to worry about that. It makes sense, if I do this, somehow that resolves itself. And that's it's a very encouraging path to be informed about and be able to live life, because it works for me. Thank you.
It does. Thank you. Thank you here. Mary, good morning. Good to see you.
My meditation, I always get in one a day, and I have to resolve to just figure out how to get in that second one. It's not impossible. It's just a matter of setting your mind to it and doing it. Harder to do that. And again, the Buddhist lessons are just so amazing. They should be broadcast by speakers all over the world. Yeah. Because they just make so much sense, and it really puts everything that's been going on in such perspective that it's just due to ignorance. Yeah. Ignorance of stress, and ignorance of people don't realize that the only people they're really hurting is themselves.
Yeah. It's really true. And that the statement of the first noble truth is so profound. The more we understand it, that it's said in different ways, but dukkha occurs simply as a consequence of living in the world, and the reason why is ignorance. And so it points back. That almost sounds too simplistic. In fact, many people will say, "Oh, that's just too simplistic. The problems are so complex and all this." It really comes down to that, and the answer is very simple. But we don't. A self-referential ego self can't accept the simplicity of that, because it gets right to the heart of the matter. I'm glad you're here this morning. Lorna, good morning. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to be here. I did read the article prior to class, and my mind was still thinking about grains of sand in the river and how many buckets of water in the ocean, and just taking that talk to, it was like a tree, there's the talk, and then there's the branches and the branches and the branches and the branches. And my mind didn't, when I read the article at home, didn't follow through on all those branches and branches and branches. And I think your talk this morning, I kind of got the gist of it. And I think you understood it, but I think I would need to really hear it all again. And so I could really follow what you were saying about the stress in life, and it asks the right questions and seeing the basic questions. I kind of got it, but I need to listen to it again. So it just grew a lot of arms and legs, a little bit quick, just to take in while sitting. But I so appreciate the talk. I haven't seen it like that before, but that's what the Dhamma is. You see a bit, see a bit, see a bit. And it just evolves. And I think this talk's been spectacular. I mean, it's just been great. And so it's always pointing to to look at these things, but this week it's just been so, in the global sense, so it's been very appropriate. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll have the talk probably posted a little later today, so you can listen to it again. What you just said, you see a little bit more and more and more and more. That's developing right view, and you see this sutta is a good example of if you took one sutta and just said, well, this is it doesn't make any sense, does it? It's hard. You have to have a general understanding of what the Buddha taught and why he taught it to see how this fits in with that, because he's basically the sutta is just saying, forget all those questions. That's what Khema is teaching the king. And even that's an important point that it's in the article, but the fact that Khema, a nun, was teaching the Dhamma to the king, this isn't just somebody walking down the street that happened. The king to summon Khema. The reason why I say that is in modern Buddhism, in some traditions, you can't be a nun. There's no allowance for female Dhamma practitioners, particularly in the Theravada tradition, even though that's changing now. For hundreds of years, you could not be a nun in many traditions. And the justification was, well, the Buddha never allowed nuns in his Sangha. Of course he did. Here's a good example. There's many examples of that. And I just wanted to make that point, just to put it out there and get on the sandbox again. One thing that I was thinking about, and then I'll finish, maybe. Years and years ago, I had a friend of mine who was a Jesuit, Brother Ken. And he had an excuse that I don't think they call it this anymore, but he had 7 nervous breakdowns. Do they call it something different now? I don't mean to be, that's just anyway what they called it. And we became pretty good friends. I used to go, and actually years ago, there was a monastery just south of Newton, New Jersey. I used to go up and meditate with him. And he said the reason why he had these numerous breakdowns is he kept asking questions that had no answer. He said, I kept asking why to everything. Why was the world like this? Why is my religion like this? Why am I like this? And he said he the point where he wide himself into this corner that he couldn't get out of. And so he gave me this great bit of advice that I didn't take till then, but I do today. He said, never ask why. He says, if you ask why, for one thing, it means, and I didn't understand this until much later. He says it means you don't want to know, because you just get caught up in this. So when we find ourselves asking why about things, in a great way, or in a personal way, why is this person like that? Why am I like this? And come back to what's occurring in the moment. That's the essence of mindfulness. Okay, that's enough today. Oh, I'm sorry, eBay.
It's kind of changing the situation, but sort of to something that Mary said about meditation and not getting the afternoon one in. And for me, from the very beginning, I've really not been able to develop a pattern of meditation that you would say is good. But the whole other side of it is that because there are the Four Noble Truths and because there's the Eightfold Path, that even though my meditation is not going where it's not as consistent as it should be, there is still so much more that has helped me to become the person that I'm, well, just to be, to follow this path and this practice that such a deep foundation, because we normally right now, meditation, mindfulness, and do that, but it doesn't work if you don't have, you tell us about that guy who's, he's meditating on nothing.
Yeah.
And it's really true. You have to have all this other stuff, and it's so important that we have a way, thank you, to understand it and to really be a foundation to the meditation. And so that even a little bit every once in a while holds us, Mike was able to come back because it holds you.
Yep.
Because it has that foundation. So the Buddha was,
Thank you for saying that. It's so important. It's not just meditation. And of course, I believe that it's best to meditate twice a day, even 3 times a day if you want to. But even so, right, that meditation, you can meditate 24 hours a day. And if you don't have the framework of the Eightfold Path, you're likely it's not going to be helpful. And you could get yourself in some pretty serious mental states by doing that. So it does take an Eightfold Path. It becomes mutually supportive. So the second, one of the things, just a little bit of advice too, this, as far as the second sit, if you're sitting in the morning for say 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, the sit has to be the same length of time. It often helps to start it by just saying, it's 5:30, I'm going to sit for 2 minutes, and start doing that. And yeah, and then eventually you build on that. It's just a much more effective practice to meditate twice a day. But almost everybody I've ever taught, it took them a while to first build up 5 or 7 or 8 minutes, and then to add a second practice, and that took some time too. So.
And often, even though I do feel that off my cushion, I have a feeling of meditativeness, even though, I'm not meditating as often. So that's what's important to me, is that it is pervasive in my life.
Yeah.
If I can't sleep at night, if I'm doing something throughout the day, I'm always drawn to refer to help me kind of get myself squared away and balanced.
Yeah, it's all practically applied. It makes our lives better almost instantly. Thank you. Any other questions or comments before we finish with Metta? No, I had an announcement. What is it? Oh, our retreat's coming up in just about 2 months. So if you're going to go, I hope you all go. Now's the time to sign up. There's info on the website. We'll finish with the Metta Sutta. So find your relaxed meditative posture and gently close your eyes and gently close your mouth. And take a moment to become aware of the sensation of breathing in your body, and let that mindfulness of your breath cease any distracting thoughts to the past or to the future, or that may have arisen from our talk today. Excuse me. Metta means goodwill or loving kindness. It's both an aspiration for those of us developing the Eightfold Path and an ongoing expression of an awakened, fully mature human being. And these are the Buddha's words on Metta from the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature, do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove, wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. Radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. Whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Thank you all for a wonderful class. Peace.